Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and/or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the Lazarus Project, Season 1, Episode 2. Another great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. So I talked about it a lot last episode, and this episode really kind of continues what I think is such a unique perspective on the whole time travel thing. Like, obviously, we've had time loops before, but utilized in this way, and it's taking kind of that Groundhog's Day element and stretching it and twisting it in an even more darker way than it's always kind of like. Time loops are always used to tell very like heartbreaking and kind of dark stories. I mean, there's usually like a moral like lesson that's supposed to be taken from, or some lesson that's supposed to be taken from them. But in this particular regard, we are dealing in the aftermath of what happened to Sarah, and now it is on George to kind of have to live with that, because she's alive, but it is a thing of he doesn't know whether or not she'll make it or not, and Archie's trying to be there for him, because I do think it's such a beautiful thing of we see the journey that George is going through, and we parallel that with what's going on with Archie's past. Because when Archie was like Archie and that Ross guy, I was thinking like, are we gonna find out that's Rebrov or something? But it's like, no, different people. But he was like another member of the team around the same time. But the summer of 2018 ends up being like this. I guess it's like, it is that interesting, like two past situations, because George and Archie's stories parallel in like three different points, because Archie's story parallels with George of 2018 as well as George of present day of 2023, because of being in an exact situation. Just like I talked about it before in last episode about like how like crazy this like utilization of time travel, where it's like you could go a year does not, like, time can go by fast, but at the same time a year, especially when you turn back time, can be excruciating. It can be both the worst thing and the best thing, but even when it's the best thing, it can be the worst thing, because like I said, if you could live up to almost an entire year, you're about to hit that next checkpoint and something terrible happens, and you end up having to rewind everything, which could be a good in some regards, but terrible in others, because Archie makes the point, as Shiv kind of says, oh, the one baby every 4 seconds thing, but then like George had to correct him. It's like, no, she said 4 babies a second. He's like, really? God, that's even worse. It's like 4 babies are born a second, and that basically, if you go back 9 months, if we undo everything in like 9 months, all those babies could be undone. And like, it's not like, obviously we know like the butterfly effect and everything, but I've never heard anything kind of really break down the statistics like that of like, you will be, what's like 2.5 million babies, wasn't it, like in a week or something like that is born? It was something like that, she was saying. And that might even been in a year time. I don't think it was in a year time frame, but like she was saying, like the fact is 2.5 million babies could be born and they could be wiped out of existence. Most women would go their entire lives, billions in fact, would go never knowing the truth. But the fact of the matter is there are people like a Janet who used to work with the Lazarus Project, who had a baby, and then the conception was kind of undone because of a rewind, and she had a different baby. It's like, which is some Flashpoint type of stuff, you know, because obviously they did something like that. I mean, obviously the Flashpoint is a great example of like, oh yeah, like a new timeline being created when you try to undo and everything and nothing goes back the way. Specifically, the TV shows really kind of dived into that, and I'm sure the movie's going to deal in those implications for the DCU, but you get the point I'm trying to make, and I think that's such an, once again, when you put a number to that statistic, because Archie's trying to make a point of there's too much at stake for us just to willy-nilly rewind time. Because George doesn't talk about it, but we know, like, obviously in original, before the rewind, at the beginning of the series, Sarah was pregnant. But that got undone in the second timeline. And it seems like in the third timeline, you know, based on what we know of the show, the third time around, this current timeline, that still never happened. I said current timeline because technically where we are in the show, this is like the fourth timeline because they reached their next checkpoint and that got undone last episode when Rev activated the device. So it's like, okay. Because there is a lot that George has to unpackage. It's right, you saw the Dane get shot in front of you. That's traumatizing. And you heard me die. He's like, yeah, but then my girlfriend got pushed in front of a truck and almost died. So that's kind of taking precedence. But the point is, you have to deal with the trauma of not only did that all happen, you also died too. It is the reality of it. Of just, we can't just willy-nilly, like we have our, we have what we do. We do what we do for a reason, and that we can't just rewind it every time we want to. It has to be under the right circumstances because it's not supposed to be just about the one individual human experience. Our lives are kind of expendable. We know what this project is about. We know what the cost is, because if our lives being sacrificed means something in the greater good of everything, then it all works out. Because it's just like, once again, just the implications of just like so many lives affected by us rewinding time. So it has to be the last option, because it's about trying to protect the timeline as much as possible. Because that's also a point I made last episode, where if you want things to go exactly the way they did before, you'd have to meticulously make sure everything plays out, especially if you played out life for an extensive period of time before the rewind. You'd have to make sure, like, okay, I lived this life. I've got to try and make sure I get everything lined up again. Once again, like a butterfly effect, like using the movie, for example, but also just like any time travel thing of like, okay, I need to make sure things go exactly this way, but they never will. There will always be different variations. There will always be something different that you can never account for, because not just your experiences, everything in the world is being experienced and played out a little differently. So nothing's going to play out exactly the same, and trying to control that, I think, is enough to drive anyone mad. Like, that's just the horror element of being able to remember. And especially in this episode when we got Archie talking about how, because George starts remembering the other, like he was remembering the time he met Sarah, which was the summer of 2018, where Lazarus Project had to restart time multiple times, had to reset multiple times. Like we saw it like over maybe like 24 times or something like that. Maybe probably not, but definitely it felt like over like a dozen times. But I mean, who knows how many times like things had to like their Ross and Archie's attempts to stop World War III, like how many times they had to restart. And like I said, we're paralleling that with George meeting Sarah. But the point Archie was making is that, and this was something I wasn't really thinking about last episode, because I was, like I said, I was curious about how this seems like one of those shows, like when you create a new timeline, the old timeline's dead. Like it's not like, oh, it exists in some parallel and it continues on. It seems like it's wiped from the space-time continuum existence. Once again, who knows how many timelines have been wiped. But what about all that knowledge, those memories, for Archie? Once she said, like, once you get the jab, once you become able to remember all the timelines, it kind of hits you as a flood. So you kind of remember it all kind of at once, which it can be very overwhelming. But a mutant like a George or Shiv, they will maybe remember all at once, slowly, or maybe they never remember those alternate timelines. And I think maybe we see that starting to hit George, especially like all those flashbacks we get. I think that might be George remembering all those timelines. I wonder, is he going to be a special case amongst the mutants, or is it just going to be like a thing of, no, it is like slowly but surely over this time frame, like kind of hitting him like a wave, whatever the case may be. But it's like, yeah, like this, we saw how his introduction to Sarah played out so many different ways. There's even one point he was hitting it off with this girl named Haley, but Sarah walked past him, and you could tell like he was kind of captivated. I was like, oh, was this going to be a time you didn't get with Sarah? But it seems like everything leads to you and Sarah crossing paths. It doesn't always work out, but I think the time it did work out is when things kind of stuck, but it does seem like life was putting you together, because Haley had talked to George about like, hey, do you believe in, kind of like a soulmate? Like there is like this predetermined, like there's this perfect person out there that you just merely have to meet. And it almost feels like him and Sarah, they always meet, they always cross paths, and maybe it was always a thing meant to be, but it's like, yeah, and like, in a certain regard, they finally met, where it just seemed like every other instance with him and Sarah, they crossed paths, but they never fully linked up, and became the couple they eventually did. So, but like I said, I don't think those were just flashbacks. I think those were also meant to be points of, yeah, him and Sarah were kind of meant to be, but I also do feel they only showed it like once or twice, really showcasing that it is in fact George remembering some potential previous timelines, but maybe every time we flash back to that summer of 2018, from their perspective, it is George. I mean, I would assume that's what the implications are supposed to mean, but I could be wrong in that regard. I even love the whole Shiv thing of him trying to, I figured it was meant to be a lesson and not like, I'm actually going to help you do this. But Shiv is like, yeah, you want to go beat up the guy that pushed your missus in front of, yeah, he did it by accident. And I'm all about, kind of basically in the grand scheme of things, like having the most minimum amount of effect on the timeline, try to protect the space-time continuum and stuff. But the guy still pushed your missus in front of a truck. So we want to go beat him up. It's like, well, if we do this, don't worry about it. We have enough police connections that we can just kind of sweep this under the rug. It's like, yeah, well, what are you supposed to do? Just knock on the door and punch him? He's like, not unless you can punch him through the door, which would actually be pretty dope if you actually could do that. But the whole point was like, no, Shiv did that because he was trying to like teach George a lesson too, of like, we don't want to have to do this, because what's done is done regardless of it. It is the reality of what this is. We can't dictate and go back to time whenever we want to, just because of something terrible happening, especially in our own personal lives. We have a responsibility to use this only when the time is right, when it's a necessity, when it is an extinction level, like mass terroristic, like kind of big death things. Like I said, like I said, that's kind of that slippery and complicated slope, because also like anyone in the world would have different reasons why they'd want to rewind time, just get more time with someone that they lost, and or so things could play out differently. And obviously, once again, we get that with Ross and Archie's story, where it's just like, right, we have their affair situation going on. They're both leaving their significant others. Ross already left his after the checkpoint, so he kind of has to rewind back to like that already being a thing, but it wasn't the checkpoint yet for Archie, so she ends up having to break her SO's heart over and over again because she doesn't love him. She wants to be with Ross. There's a whole conversation about moving in, so... And it is interesting how they're able to have those casual conversations when they see death coming, and they're just, right, we have to watch it all over again and just sit here and enjoy the spectacle of everything coming to an end. And no matter what they did, they couldn't prevent World War III. It would keep popping off over and over and over and over again. They try to talk to the individuals at this country to be like, no, you're being manipulated. Oh, this guy's corrupt. We can't talk to him. Let's try someone else. Try all these forms of diplomacy, and it didn't work because it's like, cool, a lot of the high-ranking people in this government are corrupt, and they're not going to listen, and it constantly leads to missiles being fired, World War III. There's even a point where Archie ended up dying, because at least they died together because of because of the missiles. But the moment Archie was like, oh, what happened to me? And Ross was like, yeah, I didn't get that far. I was like, is that true? Because I was about to say, we don't know how much further he really got, like whether that's true or not, or whether he was just like, oh, Archie's dead. I am going to end this. I'm going to let myself die because I'm not going, because usually they always go out together. It's never like one of them die. It's like, yeah, they're always there to watch the explosions from the missiles together and get evaporated. So that's why I was wondering, like, who knows in that time when apparently a bullet ricocheted off the fire extinguisher and hit her, but it's like, we don't know how long it was before Ross. He said, like, oh yeah, I didn't make it that far, but who knows what that really means. Like, he probably maybe tried to commit, but it's like, they lucked out. But it's still that thing of, hey, don't think about it. I died. It's like, yeah, don't think about it. And that might have been one of those instances where it's like, the reality of, holy crap, I died, and I might not have come back. It's like, once again, it's just the reality of it. It's just, you're supposed to be professional about it. You're supposed, I guess, kind of remove the emotion from it, but it's just like, you can't. We're all human. And that ends up being kind of a point when they end up bringing in Rebrov. It's like, right, you guys weren't chosen by God. At the end of the day, you're all humans. You're all fallible. You're the ones who get to make these decisions, because Rebrov's perspective on things is, they're trying to fight the inevitable. You know, you're trying to push it back. You're the ones kind of making decisions for the world. Like, the world wants to end, yet you keep trying to push back the inevitable. It's kind of like a very nihilistic point of view of just, not really nihilistic. I guess it's more so like, this is the realism of it. No matter what we do, there's always going to be something around the corner that's going to end the world, because that's just the way it's meant to be. We're fighting against fate, essentially. This is what's meant to be, and we just keep moving the goalposts over and over and over again. And for what? You know? Because it kind of almost borderlines on nihilism, where it's kind of like, what's the point? Like, let it all burn, because that's what it's meant to be. And this organization, like, maybe it has the best of intentions, but we are playing God here. We get to decide what circumstances we go back in time for, what we don't, you know? And it's like, yeah, we only use it under the extremist circumstances, but it's still the thing of, we utilize it regardless. There's just too much heaviness associated with this that any person could break under the pressure of this. But, you know, especially with everything George is going through with Sarah, Archie went through with it, because before Archie died and Ross was there, and Archie ended up finding out, Ross rewound time. I don't know if he set circumstances in motion to make sure, because he probably knew that Wes and them were never going to let time just be rewound. So it's like, right, I need to set things up to make it so that there is an excuse for things to kind of pop off and them to have no choice but to rewind time. That was his way to save Archie, because he's like, yeah, that's what we have to do, I'm going to do that for someone I love. Because Archie was like, no, I'm willing to die for this mission. But obviously, when the shoe was on the other foot, when Ross died, she was like, no, come on, Wes, we have to rewind time. But that particular time, Wes is like, no, we have to stick to it, because things worked out. The World War III, like, the events didn't lead up. Like, everything was kind of shut down because of Ross's death and sacrifice. So it all worked out in the end. So it's like, we can't rewind time. And we see Rebrov is there kind of, I don't know if that was one of the final, like, straws that broke the camel's back for Rebrov. And that's why he's kind of on the mission that he is. Because once again, he's not the only, like, Lazarus Project member who's going rogue. He's just, as they brought it up last episode, I want to say specifically, it was Shiv being like, he's the worst of them. Because once again, we heard about Janet, but we don't know if, like, she's still there. Like, how do you go about your regular lives? I guess it's just like, that's why they're on, like, out there doing their own things. You know, it's like, it's probably not saying it's, I think it's not excusing it, but I can understand why someone would go very nihilistic and just like I said, this place can break you when you have the knowledge of, we can rewind time. Any tragedy can be undone. We kind of tackled that last episode, but once again, it's a little different when that tragedy hits really close to home and now you're being told you can't undo it, especially in George's case where Sarah sadly dies. And it's like, no. Like, regardless of the times we broke up and times we weren't together, when things didn't work out between us, yada, 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 this is where we at. This is the life we had. That's the life I want. You know, and it's like, the one where we together and everything, but it's like, that doesn't make it. It's that selfishness of human beings of just, and once again, I'm not going to fault George for it, because like I said, it's impossible to fully shut that side of yourself down. Archie kind of had to live through it, and now she's able to kind of shut it down. But in the case of George, it's like, especially at a time when you were already in a very, like, emotional state, Sarah's death, all this happening, your conversation with Rebrov, it's all going to, like, it pushes him to where he is at the end of the episode. Because we don't know how Archie got past that. I mean, once again, it's not like that was forever ago. Especially when you think about how much time they spent together, like, prior to all of that in 2018. But all the times they had to, like, the lives and the time they spent together in it is that complicated thing of like they lived multiple lives together. Like it's like say like everything in that mission went down over the course of like maybe a week. You rewind enough time that builds up over time. So I mean, even just saying like, oh, they rewound time 17 times, but the mission always takes up about a week or whatever. But no, like let's say like 2 weeks. Oh no. What am I thinking of? About 3 weeks is what I'm trying to say, which that equals up about a year or something like that. So you get my point of just like, yeah, when you read, like you had all that time together, it's you've lived and probably potentially an entire life together of all the times you've had to reboot time. And it's just like, it begs a question, what did I'm assuming she's not with Jim anymore, her SO. It's like, what happened on, like, what did you do that final time when things well, she typically breaks up with him, like, the night before they go off to their mission, so she probably broke up with him, but obviously she doesn't have Ross, so she understands where George is coming from. They just haven't had a conversation about it, because it's not something easy to talk about, because obviously she's been exactly where George is, begging, like, he hasn't begged about the whole thing, but it's still, Archie understands where he's coming from of like, right, wanting to rewind time. I was there, but for her, it's probably like, me speaking on it you have every right to feel what you're feeling. What's done might be done, but you're allowed to feel what you feel, and I can't try and mitigate that. I shouldn't try and lessen those feelings, even if I've been in the same boat, so you don't feel like you're so alone. We've all felt that, but that's not what you need to hear right now. You're entitled to feel what you've got to feel, We also learn Lazarus Project isn't afraid to do some torture. Apparently, like, Shiv is kind of like the first one who kind of really popped it off, apparently, of like kind of waterboarding and drowning people. And it's like, yeah, that's why there's no cameras in this particular room, because that's what they kind of do. Even Red Rob being like, oh yeah, we used to kind of give him the nickname Chuckles, which obviously, I guess, I don't know if that was meant to be like he used to have kind of a sense of humor until that kind of got broken out of him, or whether it is a situation of, it was always meant to be, it seemed like he was implying like it was always meant to be an ironic name, I think. It's just that interesting double-edged sword that it's associated with all time travel stories of, no matter how good your intentions is, there will always be a double edge to it, of especially in their regards, because once again, at any point in time, they can reset time when necessary, but doesn't always mean there will be situations that call for it to be reset. So you can lose so many people along the way. And like, hell, there's going to be times where they might not rewind time for you. So that's a little bit of like, once again, it's like, right, Ross was able to rewind time for me, but I couldn't for him. So like, that's why I was wondering, how, like, did things severely, like, maybe I brought it up earlier. I wondered, because I felt like Ross, the way he implied it to Archie of like, yeah, he set things in motion to make it so that time did get reset so she'd come back. So, but it seems like Archie didn't do that, at least not to our knowledge. She tried to go through the proper channels about rewinding things, but it's like, yeah, they were in a timeline now where it's like things worked out for the better, so we kind of have to let things be. And so that's got to weigh on her where it's like, Ross went through so much to bring me back, but I'm not able to return the favor, and I kind of have to live with that, hey, I'm alive and he's not, and, the guilt of he did it for me, but I couldn't do it for him. Like, that's got to be pretty rough, And I'm curious if George, how much of what we're seeing at the end is going to be the thing? Is George playing Rebrov because he's like, is he really in that place where it's like, hey, I am going to try and rewind time? Or is he trying to get close to Rebrov? Like, is he going to be kind of a double agent inside of the Lazarus Project so that he can get what he wants? Like, will he kind of do a Ross where he'll manipulate a situation, take advantage of a situation to get time to rewind? Because obviously, if he does it, everyone else is going to remember, like, wait, rewind time. What did you do? So, I'm sure Rebrov is going to teach him what he needs to do to make sure this all happens. So, it's probably going to be a thing of, if George does it, there will be massive consequences for it, because Rebrov will probably be like, hey, I didn't get caught. I got caught this time, but now I know to be on the lookout so that you guys aren't able to get me again. So I'll try and stay a step ahead of you. I mean, makes me even wonder, did he kind of, well, apparently, like, this time around, the reason why they caught him is because some of his, like, men ended up betraying him, but it's, like, makes you wonder, like, was that on purpose? Did he mean to end up being captured by the Lazarus Project? I don't know. Like I said, I'm just not sure if, like, I'm leaning into believing, like, George is doing this because he is so heartbroken and he wants Sarah back. So there's that. There's, like, 75% of me that believes that. The other 25% of me wonders, like, could this be all a setup and he's playing Revrov? I don't, probably not, but I'm still keeping that possibility open in the back of my mind. So it's definitely going to be interesting to ultimately see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good